minority decisions that are to pass. So, unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question?
Yes, good morning. My name is Stefan Eklöf. I work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a trade promoter. And I am, thank you very much for interesting presentations today. I am occasionally approached by Swedish companies who are interested in participating in the BRI projects that we see around the world. And they struggle to some extent to grasp where to get hold of information on ongoing projects and upcoming projects regarding tenders that are upcoming and ongoing, and information that would allow them to assess to what extent they could be part of BRI projects. And occasionally I struggle to understand where I should direct them for projects that are within the BRI. And I would like to learn from you your best advice as to where I should direct them for obtaining this kind of information. Thank you.
My humble opinion.
Okay. There are two aspects of, the BRI is, the Chinese government describes it as a state-to-state initiatives. So usually everything goes through the Chinese state or state companies and the companies or ministries of the host country, like in Africa, projects I've looked at. It's usually for infrastructure, power, rail. It's the government of the host country where the project is built is approaching the Chinese government or the other way around to discuss the projects. And in that sense, it's that's what people call not transparent, because we are not on the ground as the Swedish government has not decided to become a partner in the Belt and Road and offer the Chinese state and for example, the African Union states that we are ready to provide our technical support and even financing for certain projects. Until that happens, it will be very difficult for Swedish companies to take part in state-to-state projects. Most of the railway, dam projects, power projects in Africa has been conducted by Chinese government companies, but through state-to-state contracts. Now, the other kind of activities you have is that private Chinese companies set up projects in other countries on their own, but they benefit from both the Chinese financing possibilities to start these businesses or industries, and also they benefit from the technology they have and the needs on the ground. So they survey the host countries for the potential, and then they launch their initiatives in all kinds of... so the Swedish business, and as my colleague explained, that the Austrian business sector, they forced almost the Austrian government to open a dialogue with the Chinese government on the Belt and Road, to participate in the Belt and Road. That does not mean that it's only projects in Austria. It will mean that this will open the way for Austrian companies who are very advanced, like in Sweden, to work in projects in Africa, for example. I know Austrian companies are building railways in Ethiopia, which are financed by Chinese Export Bank. So in that sense, the Swedish business community have a big responsibility to get the Swedish government to accept an open, not only dialogue, but to participate with China on these projects. So, but the Swedish businesses themselves, they have, as I explained, Africa is going to be one of the world's biggest markets, And already now you have to prepare yourself to figure out where the Swedish technology and industries can be of service there, because everything will be needed in these regions.
Well, I think that I just want to take the prerogative to ask briefly one last question then, which I think has sort of been answered, but what changes do you see as being necessary from the part of the Swedish government to make it possible for more collaboration with the BRI? I know that you've been addressing this, but if there's any final thoughts on this topic that anyone would like to add. How do we answer the question posed at the beginning, which was, what is the relationship to be between Sweden and the BRI?
Should everybody address that? Anybody would like to? Yeah. Yeah, I can start.
Okay. No, I think the first of all, I mean, I said that we have to transform our way of thinking and be an industrial nation again, because we are not functioning as Sweden was in the 50s and 60s, where our big motive was to build a powerful industrial nation, but all financing was directed into that. So we have to reform the financial and banking system in Sweden and provide Swedish business with enough credit to participate in that. The other thing is that we have to stop all the suspicious explanations and doubts about China's motives, and we need really to understand the Chinese culture. We need to understand the thinking of the Chinese leadership, especially of President Xi Jinping. We need to learn more about China, and so that's why we understand. So we don't project our thinking on the Chinese, because our thinking is plagued by hundreds of years of imperialism, wars, and invasions and dominance. We cannot project our thinking on the Chinese. This is how the Chinese think because this is how we did before. That's not the case. We need to understand how the Chinese think so we can understand the motivations behind what they do.
Yeah, that was more important than that the speakers mentioned. They refers to the cultural exchange. And before at London this year, February, and I found myself is less understand or less acknowledge of the Sweden. And even if there was a famous brand such as the ABBA and Maersk or the SKF, there was a famous brand in local market of the Sweden. But for myself, I feel less understand and knowledge about that. So I just focus on the cultural exchange and the knowledge exchange, and improvement or enhancement is very important and the basic fundamental, and to let us know each other, and before starting to collaboration or the cooperation and between Sweden and China, and as we just discussed, and we have the more potential opportunities already existing, but how could we fund it? And for the financial institutions, we are only acting as the bridges between the exporter and importer, or the intermediary and actors between the traders. And we opened or established the branches or agents, the offices here. It's not for the purpose of the generosity. We are just going for the benefit, win and win at the principle. That was the basic principle and the strategy for all the financial institutions and for all the parties, and we started and to just the business. Thank you.
Well, I think there are two cultural barriers in Sweden, so making it very hard to go to the politicians and talk to them and say, okay, we want to be a part of the project. The problem is first that the policy of neutrality has become an attitude in Sweden. It's not about policy anymore. It's about to be neutral in everything. And if you go to the minister, if you go to the politicians, if you go to the parliament and say, okay, we will want to be involved in this huge global project, they say, okay, why me? I'm not a businessman. I don't have a company. Why should I do that? So that's the first part of the culture. The other part of the culture of Sweden is actually that we are used to the grassroots. We are very good at to come up and put a pressure to those who are in top and decision makers and say, we want this. And then you get the response. So I think that in order to put Sweden on the way, on the path, to be involved in this global project, it should be all the companies, businesses, large segments, small segments, to make a lobby to come up as a pressure point to the politicians in order to have the negotiation about this being a part of the global project as a country. Thank you.
Less banks, more airlines. Thank you.
Well, the good thing about the airlines is that we get a chance to see each other. And if we can see each other, we can also talk to each other and maybe understand each other more. Yeah. But I totally agree with what Ali said about the lobby. That is a very strong, and you can see in Swedish media that some projects actually get stopped by the public. So the media has such a strong power in Sweden, and so you can say media has a strong power, and you can also say, if you say grassroots or us people, whatever you want to call it, has a strong power. Since the politicians need to be re-elected every 4th year, they want to be popular, and that's why they pay attention to us as voters, I guess. And I think for BRI, which I'm obviously I'm very pro BRI, and I try my best every day in the contacts with the local government and the central government here in Sweden, to give them some examples what actually the investment or cooperation within infrastructure, what that actually could mean to Sweden. And I also believe very much I'm a very practical type of person, so I like to do things and make things happen. So I do believe also that one good way is, of course, one thing is this lobbying. That's something that seriously has to be done in a way that is tailor-made, that is suitable for the Swedish audience. So it cannot be a completely Chinese take on this issue. It's just like KFC in China. They are so successful, much more successful than McDonald's. Why? Because they tailor-made the menu, so the menu fits for the Chinese taste better than the McDonald's. So I think we can take this approach. We take the KFC approach by tailor-making the communication like KFC, but fit for Swedish taste. So that's one thing for the lobbying. And the other part, I think, is maybe we can try to do some actual, maybe smaller projects, but just to give them some more courage, to make them feel trust the other, on the Chinese side. Because their experience of China is still so very limited. If you talk to the main politicians in Sweden today, maybe they have been to China and they went there on a tourist trip and went buying some cheap stuff in the fake market, or and saw the Great Wall and then went back. They didn't work there for 10 years and had Chinese neighbors and always ate Chinese food and celebrated Chinese New Year. They don't have that kind of experience. You cannot expect them either to have the full understanding, because they don't have that experience. So I think this lobbying and then trying to do small projects to build the confidence, to make them feel that they can rely on this and feel confident. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I think one of the underlying problems is a terrible sense of pessimism, that people don't believe that these things can generally be done. Now, the point of what I referenced with the Austrian model is that businesses decided this is going to happen. They intervened not in a nice, oh please. They said, this represents the future interests of Austria. Now, if people did that in Sweden, it's sort of like the US NASA space program. People become excited by what the future can bring. Now, if you think about I don't know the figures, but how much people in Sweden today are pouring into lotteries and casinos, which give them really nothing. That money, if people would be said, invest 50 crowns in the future of working with the Belt and Road Initiative, that could change overnight. But the Swedish government has to they have to release a certain control mechanism that unfortunately, you know, I'm a Swedish citizen even if I wasn't born here, but that's why I propose that the government has to agree to bring in the Schiller Institute. That might be controversial, but it has to be that type of intervention to break open the environment and let the population start thinking about these things. Because otherwise it won't come onto the table for the election, which is where it should be. So, thank you.
So what we're going to do now is let's thank our speakers from this panel, and then we'll hear some concluding remarks, and then we'll have lunch. So.